Welcome and thank you everyone for your interest in our latest report, which is a reaction to the prevailing narrative that older workers took part in the Great Resignation. Actually, we show that older workers did not leave their jobs voluntarily to retire, but that the mass job loss that was caused by the pandemic also drove this pandemic retirement surge. As we all know, the retirement rate for workers ages 55 to 74 has been slightly increasing over the last decade. But we see a very sharp deviation from this pre-pandemic trend since the onset of the pandemic in April 2020. So for the last 2 years, many more workers retired than the trend would have suggested. And the latest data of February 2022 suggests that retirements are still up by at least 1.1 million additional retirees. So this increase in retirement during the pandemic has fueled the narrative of a great resignation among older workers. But our research indicates that pandemic retirements are due to job loss and that they are involuntary. And this indicates that older workers were pushed out of the labor force during the pandemic. They did not leave by choice, but they retired involuntarily. And involuntary retirements force workers into retirement earlier than planned. And this results in lower retirement income and falling standards of living. Let me explain you how we come to this conclusion. Let's have a look at what happened right at the beginning of the pandemic, between March and April of 2020. Out of 35 million older workers who were employed in March, 2.1%, that is around 750,000 workers, retired in April. And at the same time, 10.7%, or 3.8 million workers, lost their job in April. And this is a significant change in the transition to unemployment. And to put these numbers into perspective, let's go back to the very same period 1 year before the pandemic. So here, the orange bars show the employment transitions between March and April of 2019. And you can see that the transition from employment to retirement did not significantly change during the pandemic. It remained relatively steady around 2%. But in fact, the flow to retirement in the first month of the pandemic is insignificant compared to the mass of job loss that we observed. 3.8 million workers lost their job within a month, compared to around 180,000 normal times. And we are interested in, and this is our most important finding, how this shock between March and April affected older workers and who ended up in retirement 1 year after the onset of the pandemic. And out of these 3.8 million unemployed workers in April 2020, we see that 400,000 retired a year later. And among those 29 million who remained employed during the first month of the pandemic, 2.4 million people retired. Again, we want to put these numbers into perspective, so we go back 1 year before the pandemic. Again, here the orange bars show the pre-pandemic numbers, which is the workers' employment status in March 2019, conditional on being employed in the previous month, which is the same restriction that we also put in the pandemic data. And we now look at how many of them retired a year later. So recall that 180,000 workers became unemployed in a normal month. And because this used to be a relatively small number, we also see that the flows from unemployment to retirement used to be very small, namely only 30,000 workers who retired out of unemployment in pre-pandemic times. But here is the interesting thing about this chart, namely that in normal years, more people retired from employment, namely 2.6 million workers. But now during the pandemic, actually fewer people retired out of employment. People were holding on to their jobs because of their uncertainty and the risks concerning the economic situation, but also in terms of health. So those who were able to keep their jobs actually postponed retirement. And this is completely contrary to the narrative that workers, especially older workers, resign and retire by choice. Most people who were able to keep their jobs stayed there, and some of those who lost them retired. So I just showed you that the increase in job losses during the pandemic contributed to this big, massive retirement surge that we were observing, and that these retirees did not leave voluntarily. So now the main question that arises is, will these workers come back to the labor force? And we cannot answer this question with full certainty, but if there is demand for older workers, they might return. So we would expect them to actually unretire, or at least that some of them will unretire, given that early retirement really hurts the retirement readiness, and because we are facing a historic high inflation rate that considerably increases the cost of living. And data show that some older workers are in fact returning, but these flows do not match the mass of the pandemic retirements that we observed. So we do not see the same large numbers of retirees that are pushed out of the labor force also coming back. But we believe that this is not because these workers do not want to come back, but because there is no demand for their skills or their experience. And the evidence for this is that wage growth for older workers is relatively low compared to young or mid-career workers. So this points to the demand side and not a labor supply side issue. And therefore, our policy recommendations that you can find in the full report online aim at the demand side. Thank you very much. We're now happy to accept questions.
Yes, just one moment. I want to point out that this report is part of a series of reports on the pandemic. And Owen Davis, who is here, reported that the people who were pushed out, and therefore the people who might have to struggle to come back in to look for a job, are really different by education level. So we have ascertained in the past with past reports that class determined your experience in the pandemic if you're an older worker, more than actually race or gender. And the punchline is that people with less than college educations seem to have been pushed out more than others. So there was some inequity experience there. But for right now, let's answer questions about this report.